Good evening and welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival. We are, of course, not actually in Wigtown. I'm talking to you from Beirut in Lebanon, which is where I'm living. My name is Jim Muir. I'm I suppose you could call veteran or old Middle East hand and a former BBC Middle East correspondent. I still do a bit of that from time to time, but not quite as much as I once did. Joining us this evening, we're very privileged to have Baroness Helena Kennedy, who is, as one of our colleagues just said, one of Scotland's biggest exports, a hero or heroine of the legal world and many other worlds, as we will find out later in the evening. We're going to be looking in a very broad framework at the role of law in the age of disruption. So we're going to be asking Helena what is on her mind at this stage in her extremely, shall we say, rich career. She was born in Glasgow. She went to school in Glasgow, but she studied law in London, was called to the bar in 1972, and has had an extremely distinguished legal career, culminating now in her role as director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, which keeps her busy, but she has a lot of other things keeping her busy at the same time. I'm going to start off with some questions. We're going to have a little chat for about probably half an hour or so, and then we'll open up the field for questions from all you nice people out there. Thank you for being with us this evening. Helena, now you were born into a kind of not a very rich family, should we say, a working class family in Glasgow. Your parents were both Labour activists. Your dad was a trade unionist. And you were also born into the Catholic Church. So your career, or if I'm looking at the boxes that you've worked your way through, you've got your faith, you've got Labour and politics, and which is very much in your DNA, I would say. And of course, you've got the law. Now, looking at your career and how it's gone, I would say that you are a bit of a rebel. I mean, you did things that stout Catholics would probably tut about. You, as a Labour peer, which you've been since 1997, you have defied the Labour whip more often than anybody else. And I'm sure that a lot of people in the legal profession who probably would think you're a right royal pain. Are you a bit of a rebel?
I'm what Ruth Bader Ginsburg would say. I'm, on occasions, a dissenter. And what's very interesting about being a dissenter is you often find that eventually your dissent becomes actually the mainstream. And so, yes, it's true that I have often taken positions where I've been prepared to be critical of institutions to which I'm attached, and so I've never been afraid to do that.
You've been attached to very many institutions. I haven't mentioned a lot of the things you've done sort of outside the normal career path. I mean, at the moment, as well as your very exacting legal job, you're also a Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. You've just done so many things. You've written books. Eve Was Shamed is the latest one, which is now coming out in paperback as Miss Justice, originally published 2018, but now much better improved and with a new title as a paperback. And you've done all kind of TV programs, Blind Justice, Heart of the Matter, After Dark, and so on. So you've just done so many things. You make me feel monochrome, I have to say. Let's look at this stage in your very distinguished career, as you look around at the legal field here, I mean, or say there in the UK virtually, and internationally. What is it that bugs you? What do you think really needs straightening out as you look at it with the hindsight or the wisdom and the weight of all your decades of struggling in these fields?
Well, I want to first of all talk about the business of all those different things. I am the proverbial girl who can't say no, and so when I would be asked to do things, I would always think, you've got to put your toe in the water. You've got to try your hand at writing, try your hand at doing television. When you're asked to sit on things like I sat on a commission, on the National Commission on Education, 30 years ago, and then it took me into the world of education and made me. And I, of course, felt that education had changed my own life. And so I wanted to make those opportunities available to other people. So it's true, I've done an awful lot of different things. And what it does is, and it's one of the things that I like, is that you see the interconnection between things, and you see the ways in which you can learn from one piece of your life and transfer it into something else. And I think that that's been invaluable to me. I think I became a better lawyer by doing other things. And because I saw law in its context. And, you know, an awful lot of people can be practicing law and they never think about, you know, what it's sitting inside of. You know, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It really is part of, and a very vital part of our society, and it regulates all our human relationships, from our employment to our family law and stuff to do with divorce and so on. It deals with our relationship with the state. It deals with commercial contracts, and it deals nation to nation. And I suppose now, what I feel very strongly is, I mean, obviously I'm in the last chapters of my particular journey. And I want to draw on all that stuff to really look at how we create the good society. And I'm not convinced that we're doing it at the moment, I have to say. And so when we're talking about what's exercising me just now, I mean, the same things that are exercising an awful lot of people, which is that we're confronting a pandemic. We're confronting the business of COVID and all the challenges presented with that, and it affecting the way in which we live our lives. I'm a very social person, and the idea of not being able to throw my arms around the people that I love, when I see them, I can't comfort people in the way that I normally would by holding them. All those things are so terrible, all this business of distancing. So I find that hard, but I also know that lives are being taken because of it. And I'm dealing with parts of the world where COVID is being used in the most incredible way to encroach upon the rights of ordinary poor people. I mean, authoritarian rulers everywhere are using it as a cover to do yet more horrible things than they would normally do. And that's what's been interesting about joining the International Bar Association to play this role of running the Institute of Human Rights, is that I'm seeing the big canvas. And while I've had a certain amount of experience of doing work in the international domain, I'm now looking at what's happening in the world at large. And, yes, we've got a pandemic, but it's not the only crisis. The other crisis facing the world is, of course, there's climate change. There's the crisis of populism with the whole spread of, leaders, authoritarian leaders who present simplistic answers to complex problems and who basically are almost invariably highly narcissistic men who want power, and they are very damaging to the thing that we thought we'd created in the post-Second World War period, which was liberal democracy, and so I'm fearful about that. And I also am very concerned about the fact that we're facing a huge economic crisis because of the combinations of these different things, and that poor people are going to be made poorer, and many people's futures are going to be damaged. And so, if we look at the range of things, the world is not in a good place at the moment, I can tell you that. But we have to all love each other and be kind to each other in our smaller domains. But that what's worrying me just now, I think that it's this sort of neo-fascist thing that's going on is happening around the world. I mean, and it's not just that we're seeing the totalitarians that we know about, China and Russia and Putin, or the Saudi Arabians and so on, or Erdogan in Turkey, but places that call themselves democracies are now quite happy to jettison the word liberal from the democracy bit, that they are basically saying that elections are enough. And they don't recognize the ways in which all those other things like media freedom, the independence of the judiciary, independent legal professionals, the ways in which civil society has to be entitled to protest. And so all of that is being crushed and interfered with. So we should be alarmed. And we should also be alarmed that I'm afraid some of this bad stuff is eating away at what once were great democracies. And I think it's happening here, and I think it's happening in the United States and in other places too. We're going through a bad time. But as my heroine, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, said, the pendulum swings, and we have to kind of hope that there will be a swing out of this. But I hope it happens before I pop my clogs. Anyway.
Well, let's look at what you might call the head of the snake, as it were, in the biggest country in the world, America. It doesn't really help, does it, when moral values are being eroded the way they are, where things like the rule of law, but also just the simple concept of truth and fact are being challenged by people or the person at the very top there. Do you think this upcoming election in the States could be a real watershed moment? And if, suppose Trump is out and he actually does go, which is a big question whether he would go if he does get voted out, are we going to see, is it going to be the end of Trumpism, or is he there because forces are at play? You talked about populism throughout the world. It does seem to be an expression of something bigger than just sort of one man, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Trump couldn't have been elected if it weren't for the fact that there was a huge amount of disaffection, a great deal of unhappiness with the way in which politics was playing out and has been for over a number of decades. And I think that you do have to link it to the whole way in which economies have developed in the post-Cold War period. I mean, and indeed slightly before. I mean, we all laughed when Francis Fukuyama wrote his book and he said it was the end of history, and we were a bit leery, and we here in Britain were very superior about it. And we've even laughed again where we said, oh, really? When then suddenly he was saying it was the end of history. We've now got liberal democracies everywhere. We've now got markets everywhere. The free hand of the market will make everything wonderful for everybody, and a globalized world will bring goodies to everybody's table. Well, the problem about that was he didn't reckon with the rise of Islamic terrorism and the kind of alienation that many people were feeling. He didn't reckon with the business of many people from minorities feeling that they are on the margins of society, that they live in that bit of the page where there's no writing, that they don't get their moment in the sun, and all of that horrible legacy that was never addressed of racism and slavery in the United States, but also colonialism here. And so he hadn't reckoned with all of those things, and I think he's made his sort of mea culpas, but the truth is, the heart of all this disenchantment, to my mind, has been a methodology, an economic methodology, which has been taken up by everywhere. It started with Reagan and Thatcher, with the beginnings of neoliberalism then. It was called monetarism. It's had different names. But the formula is a simplistic one. It's, the idea is the state has got too large. You reduce the state. We don't want the state. It has to be too small as hell. You want it minimalist, just to police our streets and protect us. And there should be a little tax paid, and we can see that in Mr. Trump's, thing. It's all to be celebrated that he pays no tax, and you don't pay tax, so you don't have an infrastructure, you don't have welfare, you don't look after the people who are most vulnerable, you're not feeding into the schools that need resource and so on, because you don't send your children there. And so that economic model has been destructive everywhere. And it's why you've got protests on the streets of so many places, because we've had large-scale corruption everywhere, with people not paying their taxes, having offshore stuff going on, paying taxes in places that have got the lowest corporation tax imaginable. And then you have companies like Google and them all who don't pay tax here. I mean, all of that means that the stuff that you need to make the good society can't be afforded, can't be paid for. And I've seen it up close here in Britain with the reductions in legal aid and the ways in which, poor people can't have access to justice. Never mind poor people, most people actually. And so we've seen this huge growth of the gap between rich and poor. And that has fermented terrible levels of anger and distrust. And so it gives the opportunities to these men. And I'm particularly saying men because You know, I gave a lecture a few weeks ago to the International Institution of Organization of Psychoanalysts. I have often in my legal practice done work at the interface between law and psychiatry. So as well as doing sort of high-level political work, I've also done a lot of work around domestic killing, people who kill their children or kill their partners, or and looking at what is it that takes people into that place where they commit such terrible crimes. And you can ask those questions about most malfunction and most criminal activity. But I looked at it particularly there, and I came to work very closely with wonderful psychiatrists. And so I was giving this very distinguished lecture for them, and it was all organized before there was COVID, and so it had to be done on virtually. But and I was talking, in fact, in a way that I am tonight, about the challenges to our world when we're seeing the rise of populism, which is a kind of a new form of authoritarian governments that call themselves democracies but are anything but. And what these governments do is they go after the media because they hate being criticized. They're led by these narcissistic men and so on. And one of the psychiatrists said to me, Jim, and I think your audience might also find it interesting, said to me, you've made a great point about how they don't want regulation. They don't like regulation. They don't like law. And they go after the people who are trying to keep law and if you like, the rules-based world that we created after the Second World War. They're trying to untangle it and get out of it. And who don't like rules? And it's about being marooned in their own adolescence. These are men who have never matured and not been helped by and parented into maturity in ways that where they understand that good societies are built out of, considering the if you like, the collective, the community, as well as the individual. And you have to protect both. And so that's the balancing act in a decent, I think, social democracy. And so that when you stop doing that and all you're interested in is getting rid of the rules. And when I call this talk tonight, an age of disruption, people like Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson and Trump and people, and certainly Orban and some of the worst guys, they don't like law. And when they find law being used against them, they want to go after the people who are doing that. And so we're seeing that, even here in Britain, only the other day, we're going to trash international law because it's useful to us. In trying to do a deal with Europe. And they forget the implications of this in terms of our dealings with the world on so many other issues. And it's childish. And so what we're seeing is that we're being governed just now by people who have not grown up. And that's what I feel looking at Trump. And so when you ask me about America, I'm watching just now the infantilizing of their system. And that is because the man who's at the head of it is an infant, but he's dealing with the pain of so many people who are feeling that their lives haven't had meaning. And so he has a rhetoric which is, based on three words, it's always, jail them all, or, that's what they do. I mean, here we copied it, we've seen Boris copying it, get it done, or, bring back control, bring back control. It's always those simplistic notions.
But let me interrupt. How do you break through that? How do you reverse this process? It's got a lot of social roots to it, hasn't it? And it's very hard it's kind of almost systemic in a way. It's not just a few infants at the top. They're playing to a very large audience. How do you reverse that? How do you treat it?
Well, you see, it's a combination, though. It's the combining of people who provide a certain kind of leadership which denies the complexity of the problems, and people who are experiencing the problems, who want resolution and want to believe that this person might be able to deliver for them. And so, there are many people in the United States who have good reason to be feeling disgruntled and angry that they've been left behind and that they've had a pretty poor shake of things. So it's that combination. And how do you change it? The real challenge for us now is that people don't know where to look for truth, because they've been told all the time that when somebody says something that is evidentially based, they say it's fake news. And so even now, why would a man for all these years have refused to open up his tax accounts? It's coming, he says. Oh, really? Like Christmas is coming? He's basically answered this challenge about how he hasn't paid tax, or minimalist tax, and how he's lied about his own richness and so forth. But he answers it by always saying that something is fake news. And so people don't know where to look for truth anymore. And of course, it's not been helped by the fact that we now have modern technologies provided social media, which is a source of, for many people, it's their only source of information. And that is now corrupted in a way that is adding to our grief. So what do I think about the United States, and what do I think is going to happen there? I am very fearful that, if Biden wins, he will not go quietly into the good night. And many of his followers who have got militias and so on will not happily accept that resolution. And of course, there are many young Black people who are very angry, and many of them have been going peacefully doing the Martin Luther King thing. But there are also, of course, amongst them too, people who are prepared to, say that the only answer is to meet violence with violence. So I think that we could see real civil, I don't want to say civil war, but serious civil disruption in the United States after this election, whoever wins.
Might it be better if Trump was allowed to run his course and seemed to fail to actually carry through on the promises of prosperity for the workers? There's evidence that, in fact, there are fewer jobs, for example, in the car industry and so on. So all his kind of boasting about jobs may be empty. Is it better? Might it be less conflictual and better just to let him run his course, be proven to be a failure, and then get voted out with everybody saying bye and thanks, sort of thing?
Jim, it may seem like that. It may be that things are going to have to run their course one way or another, but I think that you're going to then see many people who, particularly young people, who will become deeply angered and enraged about what they see happening. And I think that many of the young Black people in the United States will feel here was a moment where they wanted to be heard about how their lived experience is being ignored, and I think that the anger will come from many of them, and they'll be supported by young white people who have been, a new generation that feel outraged that people who are different and people of color are treated differently, and many people being treated as if they're lesser. The rhetoric of hate that is produced by the White House at the moment. So I'm afraid I don't think I don't see any good way, but the coming back has to come with having somebody decent in there. And while Joe Biden isn't somebody who wildly excites me as a politician, I have absolutely no doubt about the decency of the man and the decency of the people he'll have around him. And what one hopes is that when people see decency, that they recognize it and that it speaks to parts of us that are actually still yearning for those sorts of values.
Let's look at the Yeah, I do too. Let's look a little bit at the intersection of politics and morality, if you like. The case that you got involved in quite deeply, the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was killed, obviously a cause or a situation very close to my own heart and my region here. But America is continuing to deal with Saudi Arabia. Britain is continuing to. There's jobs at stake in the defense industry, etc. So that's what I mean about the sort of morality issue versus the pragmatism, if you like, of keeping punting with the Saudis in order to get the arms contracts and the jobs. But can you tell us a bit about the Khashoggi case, because you were involved in investigating it? Whether you actually heard the tapes of him being killed, can you tell us about that?
Well, what happened was that after Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian columnist, he worked for the Washington Post and was writing quite critically of the Crown Prince, and and was sort of really opening our eyes to the fact that he was being celebrated. The Crown Prince who'd taken over was being celebrated as a great modernizer, and he was saying, "Modernizer, well, tell that to the Marines," and was pointing out that anybody who opposed him was being imprisoned. That there was an increase in beheadings, arrests of anyone that he didn't like, and so on. And so he was being highly critical of the failure to really take Saudi Arabia into the modern world in a proper way, and he had to be silenced. And when it came to light, and it came to light because it was the Turkish authorities who then publicly conceded that they had been listening devices in the consulate, and that they had these devices had shown that the man who'd gone into the embassy and not come out had actually been killed and dismembered. And so that was the allegation that Turkey was making, and was calling upon the international community and the United Nations to investigate. And the United Nations is made up of there are about 40 rapporteurs who are sort of investigators on many different issues, and so there are some who deal with matters to do with women, or to do with children's rights, or so on. And the rapporteur who deals with extrajudicial killing, disappearances of people, and so on, she wanted to have a legal advisor who was expert in criminal law, which I've spent my life doing, and so I was asked to go with her and with a forensic pathologist and a senior police person, as we made up a team of 4, and we went into Turkey in order to investigate what had taken place. And we were given access to all the ministers who'd been involved in making the decisions to go public about what they knew. We met with, we spent a deal of time with the intelligence agencies there, with the prosecution authorities, and so on. And I'm afraid that it did require us to listen to the tapes of Jamal Khashoggi going into the consulate, which he was attending in order to acquire papers to marry his fiancée there in Turkey. And he needed documents that were authorized by the Saudi Arabian authorities. And he went in and didn't ever come out again. And we listened to the tapes of, and it was planned. We heard intercepted phone calls from the consulate intelligence officers to, and indeed from the consul general to Saudi Arabia, and to the Saudi Arabian secret police, and to senior people close to the Crown Prince, saying that Jamal Khashoggi had come in and wanted these papers, and that they told him to come back on a particular date and time, and then the wheels got in motion, and there were calls planning his death. And then a hit squad came over and in a very sophisticated manner took over the consulate and were there waiting for him when he arrived to get his papers. And he was killed in a really horrifying way. And the discussions were shocking about the chilling way in which they were prepared to do that. And they brought with them their own pathologist to actually help with the dismemberment of the body. So I mean, it was horrifying to listen to somebody who walks into a place and then you can tell from this man, a very urbane, travelled man, a journalist whom I'm sure, Jim, you probably have seen on, or even had dealings with, and you heard this, a terror fills somebody's voice when they know that they're about to be killed, as he did, and it was shocking, and so I feel a sense of outrage, an outrage that the international community and governments did not immediately say, we are having nothing to do with the Saudi Arabian government while this man's in charge. And they didn't do that. Within a short period of time, he was at Davos and he was going on platforms and he was being serenaded by the business community because they want deals. And so deals become more important than humanity. And, we have to decide what matters more to us in societies. And I'm afraid that I wouldn't be trading with those people at all until they got rid of him, because I think he's a disgrace.
But he's the man in power, though. That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, he holds all the strings of power in a way that's never happened recently in Saudi history. There used to be a balance between different branches of the royal family, etc. Now he has turned it into a typical Arab regime by taking all the power into his own hands. So he has to be got out. But how you do that is very hard to say. There can't be any popular movement inside Saudi. International pressure perhaps might have some influence within the family. Perhaps there could be some kind of movement or something, but he has got all the levers of power, and I think we shouldn't make any mistake about that. Turning back to the people who have denounced him and the Turkish authorities who are leaking information about this sort of drip by drip, I don't know angels either, are they? I mean, they actually locked up more journalists than any other country in the world.
I just now I'm deeply involved with Turkey as well, because a young woman lawyer only 2 or 3 weeks ago died on hunger strike in one of the Turkish prisons, and we've also had trial watches going on there because of people, decent people being put on trial on the basis that they've objected to things that Erdogan has done, academics, any intellectual, writers and poets, lawyers, journalists. I mean, the prisons, judges, the prisons are full of them. Anybody who's considered to be a sort of a liberal Western type, Democrat, as far as Erdogan's concerned, is ripe for this. And as I say, this young woman has died just 2 weeks ago, we're in connection with all the human rights lawyers over there, and they're having the most hellish and terrible time. I don't mean reminding that the Turks haven't got a good story to tell either. And I strongly suspect that the Turks were using this as leverage against the Saudis and against the West, because it wasn't very long afterwards, you'll remember, that Mr. Trump suddenly opened up the doors to Mr. Erdogan after a conversation, which none of us are allowed to know what was contained within it. But suddenly they kind of corridor, which the Americans maintained, where the Kurds, the Peshmerga who were playing a very important role in relation to Syria, Trump took his troops out of there at the behest of Erdogan, which allowed Erdogan to go straight after the Kurds, and many of them were killed. And so he had his own reasons, and I think he was using the knowledge that he had about what Prince bin Salman had done, in order to use it as leverage for his own ends in relation to the people that he sees. The Kurds are his enemies. he feels are his terrorists, and so he wanted to go after them. And I'm afraid that there's a worse story in the background there than anybody realizes, and I have strong suspicions as to what happened there. So I mean, you know, the Turks knew that killing was going to take place. The day before, all the people who were Turks who worked in that consulate were given the day off. They were told to go home and they were having a day off tomorrow. Now, you and I know how embassies work. In a place like that, all those Turks who were working in the Saudi embassy would have also been information gatherers for the Turkish government. And so the first thing, if you're told everybody's getting the day off tomorrow, you'd be on the phone to to the person who was running you and be saying, you know, we've all been told that we're not to come into work tomorrow because there's going to be some big meeting. And if you were turning up the volume on your intercepts, you would be doing it then, you know. So I don't have any illusions about the role of the Turks in all of this, but the killing of Khashoggi was done at the hands of the Saudi state, and it was because he was a critic and they wanted him out of the way, and it's a scandal, and you know, it's one of the things that we've become mice in the way that we deal with this. We do not take our stand in the world to say this is unacceptable. And unfortunately, the United Nations at the moment is pretty much on the back foot because of the way it's being treated by Trump, and the fear that if we're not careful, the whole institutional framework that was created after the Second World War could start fragmenting. And so that's why I see this business of disruption as being so worrying for us. These are not good things, and they're indicators of all sorts of other stuff that's going on, for whether it's Putin at one end and the interference in elections, and we're hearing about it tonight in the United States, of what happened in 2016, that whole business. And I'm afraid I don't know whether amongst our audience there are many Brexiteers, but I am not a Brexiteer. I believe in multilateralism. I believe in belonging to unions. We're you know, our islands are small. We should be doing things together. And I feel that that whole Brexit thing was a bought event, and the interference was huge. And I regret to say that we'll bear the cost of it for a long time to come.
Before we move on from Saudi Arabia and Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, I'll just put in a plug for a book by a friend of mine, Ben Hubbard from the New York Times, has written a book called MBS, and it's a very close scrutiny of Mohammed bin Salman. So if any of our listeners here want to know more about the Khashoggi killing, or about the man who is now effectively, if not because his dad is still around, the king, ruling Saudi Arabia, just pick up Ben Hubbard's book. It's called MBS, so it's very easy to remember. If we look, we'll better wrap up fairly soon so the audience can get some questions in. Just one last question from me. As you look over this rather grim field that we've been surveying, and you talked briefly about China, Russia, again, there are very few bright spots there, aren't there? I mean, can you see any glimmers of hope?
There are glimmers of hope.
Tell me.
The glimmers of hope are young, because one of the great things about my having done more in the field of education over the last sort of couple of decades, running a college at Oxford, and I, you know, having been in that seat of great privilege, I'm now at Sheffield Hallam, which is a very different kind of higher education institution, and really wonderful. And you know, we know how things change people's lives, and we know also that the young do not. I mean, I really do feel hopeful about our young, because they're not filled with hate, and they really are so accepting of difference, and so, you know, I look around, and the idea of racism is abhorrent to those who are in our colleges and universities now, and if you speak to young people in schools, they find it abhorrent that people are hostile to homosexuals or to people who are in any way different. And so I just feel that they like the business of engaging with the rest of the world. And I think that is going to be the answer, is that the pendulum will swing back. I'm just getting a bit anxious that it's not going to do it fast enough. And so I want it to happen sooner, because, I want to be at the parties to celebrate it.
I'm with you on that one.
I do think, but also the other thing is, I say to this to all of everyone who's listening, I'm a human rights lawyer. I believe that what was created in creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of building on that in the years that followed that, the horrors of the Second World War. We've seen lots of horrors since. Of course, nobody came with clean hands to the creation of that document, but it is a document that speaks to people's yearnings, their yearnings for freedom, their yearnings to love and to be loved, and for those things to be part of their lives. They want fulfillment, they want knowledge, and they want to understand what makes the world tick. And all of that is there, protecting it. And that will come alive again, because people will take it into their hands and clutch at it as the answer to some of the stuff that's being done to them by authoritarian governments. So all I'm saying is, I've not lost my optimism. I think we're going through dark times, but I think that we have to light the light and say, we're not going to take it. And so, the way that bad things happen is if good people remain silent, and we can't remain silent. And every time you get a chance, you have to actually have your voice heard, and don't let governments attack your judiciary, your limit or access to justice, remove legal aid, go after people in punitive ways. Please, let's all come, stick together. We've got to hang together, or we'll hang separately.
Well, it's time, I think, that we should move on to some questions from the audience, and we'll have to be fairly tight because time is running out, although we're on the internet, so we should be able to go on all night, and I'm sure we could. One question from the first member of the audience: what made you decide to become a barrister? What part of the law is your passion?
Well, the part of the law that's my passion is human rights law, and I feel it was nationally. I mean, people always felt that human rights stuff was what happened somewhere else. It happened in Latin America and in places where there were really totalitarian regimes and torture and so on. But these issues actually are about more than that. It's about how we live our lives, and it's about respecting the humanity of each and every one of us. And so it's how we live in our own domestic environments, and how we live with our neighbours, and how we live in our communities, and all of that. And it's got as much to say for us here in Britain as it has got for us in Scotland, as it has around the world. So we've got to hold on to that, because we have to be part of that whole wonderful jigsaw. And so I'm a human rights lawyer. What made me decide to do it? Well, I do think I was brought up in a family that had very decent values. I had really wonderful parents, really good people who helped other people all the time. I saw it. I saw my parents living their faith, and they were good, and they weren't very interested in money at all, but they were interested in helping other people. And I think people would have always said that my parents were good people. So I was brought up with that whole idea that our fulfillment comes from being a decent person, and not from wanting money or wanting the approval of everybody. That there's something more to us than that. And so I do think that formed a thing about what I chose to do, because I wanted to work with people. I wanted to do justice around people. And I knew that people from my background didn't get an awful lot of change out of the law very often. But the thing that took me into doing was, I suppose, it was debating. Scotland's such a fantastic place for debating, and I don't know if it still is. I hope it is. But I learned to debate at school, and I had a wonderful teacher who taught me, who was my Latin teacher. And he, as a little girl, I was 12, he got me to join the debating society. and gave me the confidence to speak in public and I remember him, you know, we had a debate on the death penalty because it goes back that long, and we just got rid of the death penalty, and he said, Helena, you'll be for the death penalty, and Charlie, you'll be against it. And I said, no, I don't want to be for the death penalty. I'm against the death penalty. And he said, that's not the point. You have to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who might want it, and then understand why they think that. And I think it made me interested in the whole business of discourse, of looking at how you can debate and argue things. And so at first, of course, I thought that, I mean, everybody in my class, if you were going to go into higher education at all, it was to become a teacher, because the only professional people we knew were teachers. I mean, really knew. And so, and my mother thought that to be a teacher was the most fantastic thing. And she kept saying, why wouldn't you want to be a teacher? And she couldn't understand, why the hell would you want to go to London, which she thought was absolutely, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah. But I kind of wanted to see the world. And I went off to London and studied law. So It was...
we have to kind of be quite tight on answers now, because the questions are piling up and time is piling down. So there's one here about the role of the House of Lords, saying, do you think it's a good countermeasure to unhelpful recommendations by the government? In other words, is it a good stick with which to kind of whack government into shape, or is it just a talking shop?
Yeah, no, it's actually much more than a talking shop. I mean, I can honestly tell you, it's the committee structure that I think is so fantastic. I've really loved being on committees, and I mean, where you look into things in depth. And so, but is it a stick to beat the government with? Absolutely. We're going to beat the hell out of them on a number of things shortly. This business of saying that we're going to break the law and so on, and even though we signed a treaty earlier this year, I think that we'll have trouble in the House of Lords with that. But we're also going to be doing it on really getting a much better domestic violence bill. Scotland's got a really good domestic violence bill, and we will draw on some of that, but we will improve it and we will get it better. So there are lots of ways in which we did it. And I did it when I fell out with Labour, when they were trying to get rid of jury trial, and when they were taking civil liberties away, and then when they took us into the Iraq War. So, I mean, but that's not to say that I think it's the best way of having a second chamber. And I think that there are ways in which it needs to be reformed, and I would like to see it being reformed. But yes, it can take a stick to the government, and we will.
Good. Not that I'm taking sides here at all, of course. I'm totally neutral. But we've been looking also, as well as the UK, at the outside world. And we have a question here from the audience saying, can you point to a country or a leader that stands out as a role model, something that people might want to emulate? Have a good look round.
Well, listen, I mean, somebody sent me an email today saying that they thought that Angela Merkel was going to be the person who gets the Nobel Prize for Peace. Who knows who gets Nobel Prizes? I never understand how that works. But I think she actually, although she is not, I don't share her politics. She's much to the right of me, but I think that she is an incredibly principled person. I thought she was fantastic in making that commitment to the refugees, for which she's been excoriated and took in 1 million and so on. I think that she has been very firm in her dealings with Trump in a way that I admire. There's never been a sign of sycophancy. I think she's been terrific. And I think the woman in New Zealand is terrific. And in fact, I think if we look around at some of the women, they've done rather well by comparison with some of the others. Anyway, yeah.
Yes, I've forgotten about New Zealand. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and up in Iceland and Finland, there's some terrific women around. To say that all women are great, you know, because Margaret Thatcher was a bit of a pill.
A woman. Yeah. I've heard her called many things, but not a bit of a pill. That's a new one.
Hard to swallow. Hard to swallow.
Yeah. Well, that leads us on to the next question, actually, which segues rather nicely with the one about Angela Merkel, because your answer about Angela Merkel, because we're being asked here, what do you think about the EU and the UK's treatment of the refugees in Greece and Italy? What do you think could and should be done?
The whole issue of refugees breaks my heart, and the language of hate that's used towards people who are fleeing. You know, I mean, the whole business of, for example, people coming up through Africa, is that climate change is making it impossible for so many people to survive in their own places, and so they take these terrible risks, or they're fleeing horrible governments, and then of course fleeing conflict, as in Syria, and their lives are put at risk, and yet we're so dismissive of it. And I watch what Trump did in the United States to the people coming over the Mexican border and separating parents from their children as being a way that you could stop it by that kind of cruelty. I think the whole issue of refugees is heartbreaking, and all I can say to you is that we have not got the world right when we do that. And I'm afraid that Priti Patel is not going to make things better either. So I felt that Europe should have been much better in the sharing out, and Britain didn't take its fair share. And Scotland had a better offering on all of that. I mean, people were not offered to take people in, and then it didn't even happen. The business of refugees breaks my heart.
I've got a brother who's in the Highland and Islands Enterprise Board up in Caithness, and he says they're begging for people to come. They have a huge depopulation problem, and they would love to have people coming in, but they're just not being allowed through. So there seems to be an imbalance there, and Germany now is actually being praised. I mean, it's been a success story, really, because so many of the refugees have integrated and become productive members of society.
Of course. Yeah. And the other thing is that if you take the first million, you're probably going to get the pharmacists and the doctors and and all of that. I mean, exactly. you get the people who can flee more readily, the first ones to get out, and it's the poorest who come last. And so I'm sure Germany's done incredibly well out of all of that, but it was done with good heart.
Exactly. It was very heart-moving to see them welcoming people coming off trains and so on. It was actually very moving indeed. Very last question, which we'll have to be very quick with. What would your advice be to young lawyers and law students about how they can protect and promote access to justice in Scotland?
Well, listen, I come up I'm actually on an advisory panel on women and girls to the Scottish government, and I would say we need lawyers, and we need lawyers with a good heart, who will do this, who will really represent people. I mean, there are plenty of folk who come into law really to be business people, and fine and good. But I want people to come into law because they're going to act for people, people who need lawyering. And there are many, and they're being totally neglected just now. So what we have to do is come into the law, be determined, and then set up things together. We should be revitalizing the whole idea of community law centres, community practices, trying to do it in a different way, and defying this business of there only being sort of huge, enormous corporate law firms, and get back to being lawyers who deliver to our communities.
Well, I'm afraid we do have to call it a day there. Baroness Helena Kennedy, thank you so much for being with us. Thank the audience too for being with us also, although we can't see or hear them. We can see their little messages popping up here. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you to the organisers of Wigtown for the great work they've done in making evenings like this possible. So good night to everybody.
I hope I'll be able to come up maybe next year and do it in the flesh, because I've always wanted to do it.
It's great. You must come.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.